Welcome. If you've been looking at buying a WINIX filter, you might be wondering what the difference is between the WINIX 5300 and the WINIX 5500 filters, because they look physically identical. So let me go over a few differences between the two and help you decide whether you should buy the less expensive one or the more expensive one. The first thing that's visually obvious is that the colors are different. The 5300 is a dark gray color. The 5500 is black. So if you prefer the black color, then this is the one to go with. The 5300 only has a black panel up here. All the rest of the features are this dark gray. The second big difference is that the 5500 has a remote control with it. And this remote control even has a little caddy, so you can put it somewhere convenient. And the remote control has power button, turbo, auto, and fan up and down speeds. Although this remote is handy, realistically, how often are you going to have to change settings on an air filter when you can't go up and go and do it? If someone has a disability or a handicap, that would be ideal to be able to turn it on and off or change the settings. But for general use, I do not find a remote to be that useful. One of the things I would like about this filter is that if the power goes out, that it had a memory and retained its settings. The problem is every time the power goes out with these, they turn off. And when the power comes back on, they don't turn back on. You have to go around, turn them back on. So if you have a bunch of these in the house and your power goes out, you're gonna have to go around and turn them all back on. I have about 5 of these in the shop, and the shop loses power sometimes, even though it's an industrial space, and I keep having to go around and make sure that they're turned on. So I wish it had a physical switch or it had a memory for that. Now the other difference with the 5500 is that it has a different carbon filter. So let's take a look inside here to show you the difference between the two. Both filters have the same mesh pre-filter that's washable. This mesh pre-filter is nice. It keeps a lot of big dust particles away from the carbon filter behind it. So here's where you see the main difference between the two carbon filters that these filtration systems come with. The 5300 comes with this non-woven fiber carbon filter. It's like a mesh, kind of like a sponge. This type of filter has a lot less carbon surface area than pelletized carbon, which is what the 5500 comes with. Therefore, the 5500 with the pelletized carbon will be better at filtering out smells in theory and volatile compounds and such, because the pelletized carbon has so much more surface area and does a generally better job of removing chemicals and smells from the air, and has a much longer lifespan because of the pelletized form of the carbon. However, what you'll notice here is that there is a lot of airspace in that filter. Probably only about 50% of the cells are filled with carbon. So unless you laid it flat where the carbon would be evenly distributed on its back, that would do a good job of forcing all the air to pass through the carbon pellets. But since the filter is intended to be used upright, then all the media settles down such that half of the cells are open, so most of the air is going to bypass these carbon pellets. So how good of a job can it do of filtering the air with the carbon if 50% of the airflow is just going to pass by it? Maybe even more because it's lower resistance. The 5300, all the air has to pass through this, and this acts as a good pre-filter, a better pre-filter than this one for the HEPA filter. So in my opinion, the HEPA filter is going to have a longer lifespan on the 5300 because of this pre-filter than it will on the 5500s. You're going to have to switch the HEPA filter and change that more often because more particles are going to pass through and clog the HEPA filter than they will in the 5300. So a trick that I do, since I have both filters, and you can buy these pre-filters separately, is that I put one of these carbon pre-filters on top of the pelletized filter and then put the screen on top of that. This works. You'll notice that the screen bulges out a tiny bit. Doesn't really stay snapped in on the sides, but that's okay because the airflow is going to pass through and it's going to be filtered by that carbon pre-filter here. Now, WINIX calls this pelletized carbon filter on the 5500 a washable filter. And that is true that you can wash it, but it's not going to rejuvenate the carbon and its ability to absorb smells and chemicals. In order to rejuvenate the carbon, you would have to heat it to a very high temperature to burn off any of that stuff, in much the same way that the carbon was originally made and created. So washing it will simply clean the dust off of the carbon so it continues to remain effective and open, because otherwise the dust will clog the carbon pores. Now, in industrial air filters, the carbon actually comes after the fine filter. Like the carbon comes after the HEPA filter, because carbon will clog up with dust so easily and quickly that you want the HEPA filter to protect the carbon from the dust, because all the carbon should be doing is filtering out odors, volatile chemicals, and gases and stuff that are still in the air after they pass through the HEPA filter. So you really don't want any dust reaching this carbon filter. So this is not an ideal setup to have the carbon filter in front of the HEPA filter like it is. So a better setup for this carbon filter could be to put it in the back like this, put your HEPA filter in the front, then buy some of these carbon pre-filters, put that in the front like this, and then put your mesh pre-filter on the front of that. So now what you have is you have the mesh pre-filter filtering out any large particles. Then you have this carbon pre-filter filtering out a little bit smaller particles and dust before it reaches the HEPA filter. And then you have your activated charcoal pellet filter here to help remove any gases and chemicals and stuff that are still in the air, but it's being protected by the HEPA filter from dust, such that this is going to work for a lot longer. Now, what are the similarities between these two filters? Well, obviously their body shape is the same, they use the same housing, their control panel is the same, there's the same settings on both control panels. The only difference is that you have the remote option with the 5500 that you don't with the 5300. Both of these filtration systems also have the plasma wave technology, which is supposed to break down volatile chemicals and gases and stuff, probably using an electrical grid. And they say it doesn't generate any ozone, but it probably generates trace amounts of ozone. And I've actually smelled ozone coming out of these if the plasma wave is on. Like if it's like sitting next to me and I'm in the airflow, I can actually smell the ozone coming off of this, and I turn off the plasma wave and the smell goes away. So I have some ozonators, so I'm familiar with what the smell smells like. So there is some trace amounts of ozone coming out of this. It would be interesting to know how much. I need to get an ozone meter to figure that out. Something to pay attention to when you're buying new filters for either one of these filtration systems is that a filter for the 5300 won't necessarily fit in the 5500. Let me show you. By default, both of these units come with this filter. This is the 25220038-03 size filter. This is the filter that both of these units came with out of the box. And it works in both filtration systems. But then I purchased a Type A WINIX replacement HEPA filter that comes with these non-woven carbon filters. And if you look closely, it says compatible with WINIX models 535, 5300-2, 6300-2. It says nothing about the 5500 series. So what I found out is that this filter, this replacement filter, the Type A, has a little bit of an edge here. And this does not work if you put it into the 5500. It fits inside of it, but if you intend to use this carbon filter here, it doesn't fit in there because of that edge. So the carbon filter ends up sticking out and you can't put the pre-filter on the front. So it'll work in the 5500 if you just want to keep using these, which are less expensive and also still washable. These fit kind of like inside of the grid that's sticking out a little bit, that works in the 5500. You can use it like that. And I'll show you that it closes up just fine. So you can do that. You don't necessarily need to use this pelletized carbon filter that came with the 5500. And to double check that this depth is the same on both, it looks like 1.5 inches on the 5300, and it's exactly the same 1.5 inches on the 5500. So the depth that the filter housing is the same on both units. So the only difference is this pelletized carbon filter, and if you buy a replacement filter that is the filter A, it won't fit on the 5500, it'll only fit on the 5300. So keep that in mind. In fact, you'll see it noted here that this uses the WINIX genuine replacement filter type A, and this uses the filter type H. The last difference I've noticed is that you cannot take an H filter with the pelletized carbon and put it into your 5300, because if you put this filter with the pelletized carbon, what I notice is that the grids for both of these are different. So the front grid on the mesh on the 5300 has raised ridges like this, and on the 5500 there's no raised ridges. So what happens is on the 5300, if you try to go put this in there, it doesn't really work well. It'll maybe snap in. I can get it to snap in, but I can't get the sides. Can't get the sides in there, and it's all bowed out like this. So that's the only other difference between the two. So you can't use that carbon filter on there. You can, however, use the HEPA filter style with the non-woven carbon filter and put that in there, and that works just fine. This also explains why there's enough space for both this pelletized carbon filter and the non-woven on the front, like that, on the 5500, because there's no ridges on the mesh. So again, it's bowed out a little bit, but it's not that bad. It'll work just fine.